In the frozen wasteland of Yakutia, where temperatures drop to 70 below and human lungs can freeze in minutes, a retired researcher heard a sound that shouldn't exist. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, desperate pounding on her reinforced steel door. When she opened it, she didn't find a lost traveler. She found a 900-pound apex predator with tears in its eyes. And what happened next defies every law of nature. The story begins in the winter of 2019, deep within the Sakha Republic, Yakutia, specifically at a decommissioned Soviet-era meteorological station known locally as the Iron Lung. This is a place where the sun refuses to rise for weeks at a time, and the silence is so heavy it can drive a person mad. Living in this frozen tomb was Rachel Holloway. At 72 years old, Rachel was not your typical grandmother. She was a former ethologist from Minnesota who had spent 40 years studying Arctic predatory behavior. When her funding was cut and the station was officially closed, Rachel refused to leave. She claimed she had nowhere else to go, but the locals in the nearby village of Oymyakon knew the truth. She preferred the honesty of the ice to the chaos of the modern world. She stayed behind as a caretaker, living off supply drops and her own stubbornness. On the night of January 14th, the worst blizzard in a decade slammed into the region. The locals called it a black purge, a storm so dense you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The temperature plummeted to minus 62 degrees Celsius. Inside the station, Rachel was huddled by her wood stove, the only source of heat keeping the hydraulic fluids in the generator from freezing solid. The wind was screaming like a banshee, tearing at the corrugated metal roof. But around 2 a.m., Rachel heard something else. Thump, thump, thump. It was a heavy, dull rhythm against the main airlock door. Rachel froze. No human could survive outside in this storm without a vehicle, and she hadn't heard an engine. Bears were known to attack stations, but they didn't knock. They tore. They smashed. They didn't have rhythm. She grabbed her flare gun, her rifle was in the storage locker down the hall, and moved toward the entryway. The steel was vibrating. Thump, thump. It sounded weaker now. Desperate, Rachel wiped the frost from the peephole, but it was blacked out by snow. Her heart hammered against her ribs. If she opened that door and it was a hungry male polar bear, she was dead in seconds. If it was a person dying of hypothermia, and she didn't open it, she was a murderer. She checked the external security camera monitor. The feed was static, glitching from the cold. Then, for a split second, the image cleared. Rachel gasped, dropping the flare gun. It clattered loudly on the concrete floor. On the screen, a massive white shape was slumped against the door. It wasn't attacking, it was leaning. A polar bear. But not just any bear. It was emaciated, its fur matted with ice and blood. "It's dying," Rachel whispered to the empty room. She knew the protocol. Never let a predator in, never break the seal. But Rachel saw something else on that grainy monitor. The bear wasn't just leaning, it was clutching its stomach. It was clawing at the metal not with aggression, but with a strange, frantic, pleading motion. Against every instinct, against 40 years of scientific training, Rachel Holloway disengaged the heavy iron bolts. Clang, clang. She shoved the lever down and the wind exploded into the room, blinding her with snow. The heavy door was pushed open, not by the wind, but by a massive, wet, white paw. Rachel stumbled back, grabbing a pry bar, ready to fight for her life. The beast crawled in. It didn't roar. It wheezed. It collapsed onto the entryway mat, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind it due to the hydraulic closer. Silence returned, save for the ragged, wet breathing of the animal. Rachel stood trembling, staring at the creature. It was a female, immense, yet skeletal. And then, Rachel saw the distended belly. She saw the way the animal's muscles rippled with spasms. This bear wasn't hunting. She was in labor. And something was terribly, terribly wrong. The smell hit Rachel first, a mix of wet musk, old blood, and the metallic tang of fear. The bear, a massive sow easily weighing 800 pounds despite her malnutrition, filled the entire airlock. Rachel stood pressed against the inner door, the pry bar shaking in her grip. This was an apex predator, a killing machine that could take a seal's head off with a single swipe, but the bear didn't move toward her. The animal's head was resting on its paws, its black eyes fixed on Rachel. They weren't the eyes of a killer. They were glazed with pain. The bear let out a low, guttural moan that vibrated through the floorboards and into Rachel's boots. The animal's body convulsed. "You're in trouble, aren't you, girl?" Rachel said, her voice shaking. She knew she was insane for speaking to it, insane for not running to the rifle locker. The bear whuffed softly, a sound of submission. Rachel took a step forward. The bear didn't growl. It just watched her. Rachel realized the blood on the bear's flank wasn't from a fight, it was from the birth canal. She had been trying to give birth out in the storm, and the cold had likely caused her muscles to seize up. Or worse, the cub was stuck. Rachel's scientific mind took over. She rushed to the supply closet and grabbed blankets, towels, and her medical kit. It was a kit designed for humans, not megafauna, but biology was biology. She approached the bear slowly. Easy, easy now. The bear flinched when Rachel threw a wool blanket over its shivering flank. But she didn't strike. Rachel knelt beside the massive hindquarters. The heat coming off the animal was intense. Rachel put on long rubber gloves. She had delivered calves on her family farm in Wisconsin decades ago, but never a polar bear. She inspected the animal. The problem was immediately clear. The cub was breech coming out feet first, and the mother was too exhausted to push. The labor had stalled. In the wild, both mother and cub would be dead within hours. Okay, Rachel gritted her teeth, sweat forming on her forehead despite the cold room. I'm going to help you, but if you bite me, we both die. Deal? She moved her hands into position. The bear roared a deafening sound in the enclosed space and thrashed her head back. Rachel threw herself flat on the floor as razor-sharp teeth snapped inches from her face. "Stop it!" Rachel yelled, slapping the floor. "I'm helping you." Incredibly, the bear stopped. She panted, her tongue lolling out, and laid her head back down. It was a moment of absolute, impossible understanding. The animal seemed to realize that the tiny human was her only chance. Rachel went back to work. She had to time her pulling with the bear's contractions. "Push," Rachel yelled, bracing her boots against the bear's thigh. The bear groaned and strained. Rachel pulled. The slick, tiny legs of the cub began to emerge, but it was stuck at the shoulders. "Come on," Rachel screamed, her arms burning. Suddenly, the station's lights flickered and died. The generator had stalled in the storm. They were plunged into pitch darkness. Panic rose in Rachel's throat. She was in the dark with a wounded predator. She could hear the bear's breathing change. It was becoming rapid, panicked. The mother was giving up. "No, you don't." Rachel fumbled for her flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the steam rising from the bear's body. Rachel saw the problem. The umbilical cord was wrapped around the cub's neck. If she pulled now, she'd strangle it. If she didn't, it would suffocate anyway. She needed a knife. Her medical shears were on the table, 5 feet away, past the bear's snapping jaws. Rachel looked at the bear. "I have to move. Don't kill me." She scrambled past the massive head. The bear tracked her with the flashlight beam but didn't move. Rachel grabbed the shears and dove back into the birth canal. With surgical precision, she slipped the shears in, finding the tension of the cord. She couldn't cut the cord, yet it was the cub's lifeline, but she could use the blunt tip to hook it and loosen the loop. She worked blindly, by feel, her hands slick with fluids. She felt the cord. She hooked it. She pulled. The loop loosened. "Now! Push!" Rachel roared. The bear gave one final, earth-shaking heave. Rachel pulled with everything she had. With a sickening squelch, the cub slid out, landing right in Rachel's lap. It was tiny, no bigger than a guinea pig, hairless, blind, and absolutely silent. Rachel stared at the small, limp form in her hands. It wasn't breathing. The mother bear lifted her massive head, sniffing the air, waiting for the sound of her child. When she heard nothing, a low, Heartbreaking whine escaped her throat. She tried to turn, her claws scraping the concrete, her eyes fixing on Rachel with a sudden, terrifying intensity. If this baby was dead, the truce was over. Rachel was just meat. Rachel dropped the shears. She brought the tiny, wet nose to her mouth, and she did the only thing she could think of. She gave the polar bear cub mouth-to-nose resuscitation. Puff, puff, nothing. Puff, puff, breathe. Damn you, Rachel whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. Puff, a cough, a tiny, high-pitched squeak, and then a mewling cry that filled the silent room. The mother bear's ears perked up. Rachel scrambled back, sliding the crying cub toward the mother's face. The massive sow gently, so gently it defied physics, reached out a tongue the size of a dinner plate and licked the shivering creature. Rachel collapsed against the wall, her heart hammering like a drum. She watched as the mother curled around the infant, her body heat radiating like a furnace. But as Rachel watched the tender scene, she noticed something metallic glinting in the fur of the mother's neck. She shone her flashlight closer. It wasn't a research collar. It was a thick, crude iron band with jagged edges, a trap remnant. Or worse, a shackle. Rachel's blood ran cold. This bear hadn't just escaped the storm. She had escaped from humans. And if the markings on the collar were what Rachel thought they were, the people looking for her were not scientists. They were something much more dangerous, and they were likely following the tracks. For 3 days, the storm raged outside, burying the station in 10 feet of snow. Inside, a strange, quiet miracle was taking place. Rachel named the cub Pax Latin for peace because, despite the violence of the blizzard, the interior of the airlock had become a sanctuary. Rachel spent those hours sitting on a crate, watching the massive predator nurse her young. The mother, whom Rachel began calling Ursula, was weak. She drank gallons of water mixed with sugar and salt that Rachel slid toward her in a metal basin. But she wouldn't eat the dried meat Rachel offered. Ursula's eyes, once glazed with pain, were now sharp and intelligent. They followed Rachel's every move. On the 4th morning, the wind finally died. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel took a pair of heavy bolt cutters from the tool wall. She approached Ursula slowly. The bear growled low in her throat, pulling the cub closer. "I know," Rachel whispered, holding her hands up. "But that necklace you're wearing? It's calling them." She pointed to the iron collar. The red LED light on the underside was blinking faster now. It was a transmitter. Ursula seemed to understand the intent, if not the words. She lifted her chin, exposing the thick fur of her neck. Rachel's hands shook as she fit the jaws of the cutter around the iron band. It was high-grade steel, jagged and cruel, digging into the animal's skin. Snap! The metal gave way with a loud crack. Rachel peeled the collar off and threw it into the corner. She examined it under the light. Engraved on the inside wasn't a research number, but a name. V. Korzov. Private property. Rachel's stomach dropped. Viktor Korzov. In Yakutia, that name was whispered with fear. He wasn't a scientist. He was an oligarch with a private hunting reserve in the north, a place where billionaires paid to shoot exotic animals in fenced enclosures. This bear hadn't been wild. She had been a prisoner, bred or captured for a canned hunt. And she had escaped. Suddenly, the silence of the tundra was shattered. The high-pitched whine of high-performance snowmobiles. Not one, at least 3. Ursula's ears pinned back. She let out a roar that shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. She knew that sound. Rachel ran to the window. Cresting the ridge of the glacier, 3 black snowmobiles were flying toward the station, kicking up tails of snow. They were moving in a tactical formation. Rachel grabbed her rifle from the locker. It was an old bolt-action Winchester, meant for scaring off wolves, not fighting a paramilitary force. She checked the chamber. 5 rounds. She ran back to the airlock. "Stay," she commanded the bear. She hit the button to close the inner blast door, sealing the bear and the cub inside the entryway, separating them from the main living quarters. It was for their safety. If the men breached the main room, the bear would be hidden behind the second steel door. Rachel stepped out the front entrance of the station, locking the door behind her, and stood on the small concrete loading dock. The cold air hit her like a hammer, -40 degrees instantly biting her exposed skin. The snowmobiles skidded to a halt 10 yards away. 3 men dismounted. They were dressed in expensive, high-tech, white camouflage Arctic gear, carrying semi-automatic rifles slung across their chests. The leader pulled down his face mask. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow and cold, dead eyes. Rachel recognized him from the local news reports she'd seen years ago. Sergei Volkov, Korzhov's head of security. A man known for making problems disappear. "Mrs. Holloway," Volkov said, his English perfect but heavily accented. "You are far from home." "I live here," Rachel said, gripping her rifle. "You're trespassing on government property." Volkov laughed, a dry, cracking sound. "Government? This station was sold for scrap metal 5 years ago. You are squatting, but we are not here for the real estate." He took a step forward, unslinging his rifle. "We tracked a signal to this building, a very expensive piece of inventory, a white bear. She is pregnant. The boss wants the cub. He wants to mount the mother." Rachel's heart pounded against her ribs. "I haven't seen a bear in weeks. The storm buried everything." Volkov smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He pulled a device from his pocket. It beeped rapidly. He pointed it at the station. "The signal is coming from inside, Rachel. Don't lie to me. It is rude. I took the collar off a carcass I found." Rachel lied, desperation making her voice shrill. "The bear died in the storm. I brought the collar in to salvage the electronics." Volkov stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he racked the slide of his rifle. "Then show me the collar. And show me the carcass." "No," Rachel said, raising her Winchester. Volkov didn't even flinch. "There are 3 of us, Rachel. You have an old bolt action. Do the math. I'll shoot you first," Rachel warned, though her hands were trembling. "Maybe," Volkov shrugged, "but my men will burn this station to the ground with you inside." He signaled to the 2 men behind him. They moved forward, pulling crowbars and canisters of fuel from their sleds. "Open the door, Rachel. Or we open it." Rachel backed up against the cold steel of the door. She could hear Ursula on the other side, pacing, chuffing. The bear could smell the men. She could smell the threat. "Last chance," Volkov said, raising his weapon. Rachel closed her eyes. She wasn't going to let them take the cub. She tightened her finger on the trigger, but before she could fire, a massive boom resonated from inside the station. The heavy steel door behind Rachel didn't just open, it bulged. Crunch. The hydraulic hinges screamed as something possessing the strength of a freight train slammed into the door from the inside. Volkov froze. What was that? Crash. The door flew off its top hinge, swinging wildly and knocking Rachel off the platform into the snow. Out of the darkness of the station, Ursula emerged. But she wasn't the weak, dying animal Rachel had nursed. She was a mother defending her child. She stood on her hind legs, towering nearly 10 feet tall, a wall of white muscle and rage. She didn't look at Rachel. Her black eyes were locked onto Volkov. The violence that followed was fast and primal. Volkov screamed, raising his rifle, but he was too slow. Ursula dropped to all fours and charged. She covered the 30 feet between the door and the snowmobiles in a blur of motion that the human eye could barely track. Volkov fired a burst of shots. Pop, pop, pop. But the bullets seemed to vanish into the bear's thick winter fat and fur. She slammed into him, the force of the impact sending him flying 20 feet through the air like a rag doll. He hit a snowbank and didn't move. The other 2 men panicked. One turned to run, slipping on the ice. Ursula was on him in a second. She didn't bite him. She swatted him with a paw the size of a shovel. The blow broke his arm and sent him spinning into the side of the snowmobile. He curled up, screaming in terror. The 3rd man, the youngest, scrambled onto his snowmobile and frantically yanked the starter cord. The engine roared to life. He gunned it, kicking up a cloud of ice, and sped off toward the horizon, leaving his comrades behind. Ursula stood over the remaining conscious man, her breath steaming in the cold air, drool dripping from her jaws. She roared right into his face, a sound so loud it vibrated in Rachel's chest from where she lay in the snow. The man scrambled backward, crab-walking through the snow, sobbing, leaving his weapon behind. He got up and ran, stumbling blindly into the white wasteland after the snowmobile. Silence returned to the station. Rachel pushed herself up, her side bruising where she had fallen. She looked for the bear. Ursula was standing over Volkov's unconscious body. She sniffed him once, then turned away with disdain. She wasn't a man-eater. She was a protector. She had neutralized the threat, and that was enough. She turned her massive head toward Rachel. Rachel froze. She was unarmed. Her rifle was lost in the snow. Ursula took a step toward her. Blood from a bullet wound on the bear's shoulder stained her white fur red, but she didn't seem to notice. The bear stopped 3 feet from Rachel. She lowered her head until she was eye level with the old woman. Rachel could feel the heat of the animal's breath on her face. Ursula let out a soft, rhythmic chuffing sound. It was the same sound she made to the cub. Then, slowly, deliberately, the bear nudged Rachel's hand with her wet nose. She held the contact for 5 seconds, a silent, profound acknowledgement. "We are even." Ursula turned and lumbered back into the broken doorway of the station. A moment later, she emerged, carrying the tiny, squeaking cub gently in her jaws. She didn't look back. She walked past the abandoned snowmobiles, past the unconscious Volkov, and headed north, toward the sea ice, toward freedom. Rachel watched until the white shape disappeared into the white horizon. Epilogue. Rachel radioed the authorities using the emergency channel on one of the abandoned snowmobiles. A rescue helicopter arrived 6 hours later. They found Sergei Volkov half frozen but alive. He was arrested and later testified against Viktor Korzhov's illegal poaching ring in exchange for a lighter sentence. The scandal made international headlines, shutting down the operation permanently. Rachel Holloway was evacuated and retired to a small cottage in Oregon, leaving the Arctic behind. She never told the press the full story. She told them she hid while the bear attacked the poachers. She kept the secret of the birth, the CPR, and the connection she shared with the beast. 3 years later, Rachel received a package from a friend who still worked on a survey crew in Yakutia. It was a photograph taken by a remote wildlife drone, hundreds of miles north of the old station. The photo showed a massive female polar bear walking across an ice floe. Walking right beside her was a young, healthy male cub. The female was looking up, straight into the drone's camera. Rachel grabbed a magnifying glass. There, on the bear's left shoulder, was a patch of white fur that had grown back slightly different, a scar where a bullet had once struck. Rachel smiled, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. She flipped the photo over. Her friend had written a note on the back. "The locals say this bear is different. She attacks poacher camps, destroys their traps, but she has never harmed a scientist or a civilian. They call her the Guardian." "I thought you'd want to know." Rachel placed the photo on her mantle. The iron lung station was gone, rusted into the earth. But out there on the ice, Pax and Ursula were alive. And the North remembers. Rachel Holloway proved that compassion is a universal language, even between species that should be enemies. She saved a life, and in return, the fiercest predator on Earth saved hers. This story reminds us that nature is not just cruel, it is capable of profound gratitude. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories of survival. What would you have done if a 900-pound bear knocked on your door? Would you have opened it? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a new upload.